Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Larry Reed about his book, Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myths of Progressivism. Mr. Reed is president of the Foundation for Economic Education. He previously served as the president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy and is currently the center's president emeritus. He is also the author of Real Heroes, Inspiring True Stories of Courage, Character, and Conviction. You can follow his work at fee.org. You can find him on Facebook under the Lawrence Reed Public Figure page, with Reed spelled R-E-E-D, and you can find him on Twitter at Lawrence, that's L-A-W-R-E-N-C-E, and then W-R, at Lawrence W-R. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/progressivism-myths. Larry, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you very much, Adam.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. So since the subtitle of your book is Challenging the Myths of Progressivism, let's start out with the definition. What is progressivism?
Progressivism is an ideology that goes back at least 120, 130 years, at least in the modern American context. And at the core of it is the notion that the administrative state, that is to say, a big government at the center of the nation's life with lots of bureaucracy and smart people running them, can better plan society and the economy than individuals operating freely and independently in a market economy. It's a rather arrogant notion, I might add, but of course that probably wouldn't be in the standard definition.
No, probably not. But we'll get into some of that arrogance in a little bit here when we address some specific topics that are included in this book. But let's just start out, now that we have that definition in hand, let's move on to an overview of the book. And also, why the title, Excuse Me, Professor? That seems particularly unusual.
Okay. I put the book together about a year and a half ago with the idea that college students in particular need to be armed with the response to dozens of the typical progressive myths and misconceptions. So it's aimed at college students who I hope will raise their hand in class and say, "Excuse me, Professor, what you just said is not exactly the case." Although it's really a book that appeals to people of any age who want to know what is the free market side, the free enterprise side of whatever the topic may be that progressives typically bring up.
All right, so let's move into some of these topics that progressives bring up, and let's start with income inequality. You spend a couple of chapters addressing income inequality, but why are progressives wrong about inequality and its sources and the severity of income inequality being a problem?
Progressives are troubled by differences in incomes, especially vast differences, and they assume that this is a problem that has no origin other than flaws in the free market, and that the answer to these vast inequalities is government intervention in some form or another. Now, the reason I think this is mistaken is actually multifaceted. First of all, I think in a free society, you have to expect some degree, perhaps even considerable degree, of differences in incomes. We're not the same from one person to another. We have differences in terms of the talents that we bring to the table, and some people have talents that they don't even fully appreciate or recognize until late in life. And then there are other people who have great talent, and right out of the gate, they parlay that great talent into enormous productivity in the marketplace and are rewarded accordingly. But there are other differences, or other reasons, I should say, for differences in incomes. Some people work harder and longer and smarter than others. Some people save more than others. If we could equalize everybody's incomes tonight, regardless of their contribution to the marketplace, we'd have inequality almost instantaneously, because some people would save it and some people would spend it. So progressives don't fully appreciate the fact that we are different, and that naturally will generate differences in incomes. But they also usually start as if current inequalities have no history to them, as if government never did anything to perhaps contribute to artificial or exaggerated differences. And I contend, as do some other authors in my book, that a good deal of inequality today is the direct result of obstacles that government has imposed that keep some people at least, from going as far as their talents might take them. And there's so many other government interventions, from the minimum wage to monetary policy, that disadvantage the poor and convey special privileges upon the already well-connected or wealthy, that exacerbate differences in income. But the bottom line is, I'm more concerned not so much with differences in incomes, but the fact that differences arise naturally. I'm more concerned with the artificial barriers that government erects that keep people from going as far as their talents, their abilities, their ambitions may take them. That's what we ought to be addressing, not trying to use the force of government to take from some and give to others in this futile quest to equalize incomes and make for a fairer marketplace.
Well, and it goes against the conventional narrative that one might hear in particular in a high school or college class. But you did mention in there that that government and government programs and the barriers erected by government tend to disadvantage the poor. So how is it that, and why is it that the free market is a better way of helping the poor than government is?
The poor tend, almost by definition, to lack the political connections and certainly lacking the resources as well to go a great distance in the marketplace income-wise compared to the rich. So they need a free economy more than anybody. They need opportunities. They need a growing economy, which a free one generally produces. They need the absence of special favors that too often are bestowed politically upon the well-connected and the already wealthy. It's the poor who benefit the most from a free economy, not the wealthy. They can manage almost in any environment, even if they have to move out of the country. But the poor are the ones who most need maximum opportunity, and that's what you get when you allow people to do their thing, to be enterprising, start a business, to be mobile, to go where the demand is, and serve others in the process.
All right, now another topic covered in here, in fact the chapter title, is Equality Serves the Common Good. And this seems to go right along hand in hand with the sorts of things that are taught in civics and social studies and government classes. So what's wrong with that statement? What's the problem with equality, and why is the what is essentially a slogan about equality serving the common good, why does that have shortfalls?
Well, if you're talking about equality before the law, then I would agree. The notion that you should be judged innocent or guilty of something you may be accused of based upon whether you did it, not according to your political connections or your race or your religion or irrelevant factors like that. Equality before the law, the fair and equal distribution and application of the law is a noble objective. That starts out with the notion that there should be a fair field and no favors. People treated equally. You don't tax this guy more than the next guy just because he didn't vote the right way in the last election, that kind of thing. So equality before the law is one thing, but trying to impose economic equality in terms of our material possessions, our incomes in the marketplace, that's where I have a great deal of problem, because that tends to stifle incentive and innovation. It tends to be purely redistributive. It takes from some and gives to others. It divides up the pie, but it doesn't make a bigger one. And ultimately, if you want to benefit the poorest in society, as well as everybody else, you want to bake a bigger pie. And redistributive policies that aim at equalizing incomes are inherently destructive.
Now, two comparisons that are addressed in your book, and they're often presented as either a balance test or just an outright dichotomy. You can only have one or the other. But those are human rights versus property rights and security versus freedom. Now, the conventional narrative seems to suggest that security should be valued over freedom and human rights, quote unquote, should be valued over property rights. So where do those conventional narratives go wrong?
Well, I think by suggesting that human rights are somehow exclusive of property rights, that there's some inherent conflict, is itself grossly in error. I think property rights are at the very core of human rights. It doesn't make any sense to say you have a right to your life, but you don't have a right to the property that you earn and that you need to sustain your life. So I think one of the most elemental human rights in the world is the right to accumulate property, to trade freely for it, to leave it to the next generation, to dispose of it as you see fit. So I don't see a dichotomy there. I think property rights are human rights. Human rights have no meaning, in fact, in the absence of the right to own the property necessary to sustain life. And regarding security and freedom, I know that a lot of people seem to think that there's a trade-off there, but I think that ultimately you're most secure if you are also free. Who in their right mind would want to put their entire life security in the hands of politicians? I might give them the right to protect the country, let's say, in national defense. But even there, I'm going to keep an eye on them because they often go overboard and do it poorly. But I sure don't want politicians with all of their short-term focus, their self-interest, and their inherent inefficiency and corruption. I sure don't want them in charge of my retirement or my income. I mean, I feel more secure as a free person when I'm in charge of my life, not somebody 1,000 miles away who simply has political power.
All right, and going hand in hand with the discussion of property rights that you addressed earlier is this whole notion that healthcare is a right. So, of course, if we define rights more precisely, then that might lead to some other conclusions. But what in general, what's wrong with that notion of healthcare being a right?
Well, a right is something that you are entitled to as an individual sovereign human being. And by definition, it means that other individual sovereign human beings are entitled to that too. You have no right to anything that requires someone else to be compelled to provide that item to you. So when it comes to healthcare, you have a right to seek it, you have a right to provide it, you have a right to contract for it, you have a right to buy insurance to deal with it, and so forth, but you don't have a right to use the political process to compel anybody to give it to you or in other ways to provide it or to pay for it with other people's money. So it would be a perversion of the historic notion of rights to suggest that the mere fact of you needing something means you're entitled to it. Why not food? Why not say you have a right to food? But they haven't gone that far yet in progressive thinking, although I'm sure some would. We all say you have a right to grow it, you have a right to trade for it, you have a right to eat what you want, you have a right to secure it through voluntary, peaceful transactions. But you have no right to compel someone to give you dinner.
Right, although in FDR's For Freedom speech, he almost took progressivism to that level.
Yeah, he sure did.
he made some extra steps with that.
Yeah, he was manufacturing rights all over the place, but I wouldn't argue that Franklin Roosevelt had a deep grounding in the very nature of human rights. I think he was a political opportunist who didn't think deeply about these things.
Right, and of course this also largely goes into the whole discussion about positive rights versus negative rights, and in your answer on why healthcare is not a right, the notion of positive rights largely got dispelled there too. But I want to move on to the whole issue that human beings are destroying the earth, and the only way to fix this problem is by having government action, government programs, government force. What's the deal with that? What's the truth there?
Yeah, I always thought that notion was rather curious because it's been shown time and time and again that the greatest polluters on the planet today are socialized economies, state-run industries, municipal wastewater treatment plants and other entities of government. The fact is, if you want to take care of the environment, you want maximum private property. You want people to be able to say, this is mine. I have an interest in its capital value. I have an interest in using it appropriately. And somebody else can take me to court if I use my property in a way that violates their rights or pollutes their property. So the idea that bureaucrats simply armed with political power, or politicians who have so many other things on their minds, not just the welfare of society, but often their own reelection, the idea that these people empowered with the force of government are good stewards of the environment just has no solid historical record. Now, there are plenty of examples of shortcomings on the part of people in the free market too, but if you have an environment where you can punish people who pollute other people's property, you can prove it in a court of law and assess penalties appropriately, you've got really all you need to protect the environment. A private property regime with appropriate safeguards and a court system to punish those who do violence to other people's property.
Sure, and continuing along the theme of politicians, I want to bring up some points that you address in this book that one particular politician, I guess maybe he wouldn't like us calling him a politician, but Donald Trump likes to bring up these points. And one of his main lines, one of the main themes of his campaign and of his speeches is that the big problem with the Obama administration and the Clinton State Department and the Bush administration, et cetera, is that you didn't have the right people in office, you didn't have the right people in the government, and that there need to be smarter people in the government, that he has the mindset and the type of thinking and the intelligence to provide that, and that he would put other people around him who have that intelligence as well. Now, I don't want to get into the Donald Trump issue too much, but what's the truth about this idea that if the right people are running the government, then that fixes everything?
Well, this betrays a misunderstanding of the very nature of government. Government is, by definition, the only entity in society that can legally deploy force against other citizens. And for that reason alone, you want to keep it limited. You want to keep it confined. You don't want to concentrate power so fully in the hands of a few that they are tempted then to abuse it. The idea that if you just get better people in government, too often, I think, fails to consider the inherent problems within government itself. There are systemic issues with government, and they involve such things as little incentive to improve or serve customers because the source of your revenue is coercion. There's a tendency on the part of people in government to think of using political power for personal advantage rather than for the long-term health of society as a whole. Anybody who goes to government takes with him all of the flaws, all the shortcomings, all the character defects that he had before, and then those things are magnified, not reduced, but magnified by the acquisition of political power that they get in government. Our founders understood this, and they said this is not an issue of getting the right faces in government. It's an issue of confining government to a few things of common interest and otherwise getting it out of the lives and out of the faces of everybody else.
All right, and another issue that Donald Trump brings up a lot is that of trade, and he likes to talk about the trade deficit that the United States has with China and Japan and with other countries. Now, calling Donald Trump a progressive might seem odd to some people, but of course there are progressives of all sorts of stripes these days and all sorts of political affiliations. But what do Donald Trump and other individuals who have progressive views on the trade deficit, what do they get wrong there?
Well, certainly Donald Trump, and I think many progressives, are guilty of an old misconception about the balance of trade that goes back hundreds of years. If Adam Smith were alive today, the father of economics, he'd be shaking his head and wondering why we haven't learned anything in 200 plus years when it comes to this issue. I have a balance of trade deficit, personally, with Walmart. I buy a lot more from them than they buy from me. So by the definition of a trade deficit, I've got one with Walmart. But the bottom line is, I benefit when I purchase from them, and they seem to like it. They benefit too. Both of us are better off after having engaged in the trade, and it doesn't make any sense for some distant third party to sort of add up the numbers and conclude that the flow of goods was in one direction, not the other, and therefore one party is disadvantaged because it has a deficit. And this is just as true in international trade. Now, you can argue that American industries, often, in fact, because of our own government policies, aren't as competitive as they ought to be in world markets. But the answer to that is not to complain about a deficit, but rather to get more competitive. And if government intends for us to become more competitive, it ought to get its own house in order, reduce its burden of taxation and regulation so that American enterprise can produce more goods at better quality, at lower prices, and then be more competitive in international markets. So, and I might add this too, that by any measure, even if you thought the balance of trade was a problem, the worst possible solution for it is to impose taxes and tariffs on the flow of international goods. That just cuts off our nose to spite our face. That raises the cost of goods to all of us, and probably more often than not triggers a trade war.
All right, and moving on from Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton, who of course needs some bashing here as well. One of the things that she and her campaign and her surrogates like to discuss is Donald Trump and his tax returns, and whether he paid quote-unquote enough taxes or a quote-unquote fair share, whether he found loopholes to avoid paying taxes that maybe those without access to certain accountants or those who would be unable to identify those loopholes would be paying. And they promote this idea that because Donald Trump is wealthy and he has to give back, he has an obligation to give back, and taxes are the way to do that for him and for other people who are wealthy and who are rich. What's wrong with the idea that rich people have an obligation to quote unquote give back?
Well, put aside for a moment the fact that there are some wealthy people who acquire and sustain their wealth through political connections. As a free market advocate, I'm very much opposed to that. But progressive demagogues like Hillary Clinton are just opposed to wealth or wealthy people per se. Even the ones, which is the great majority, who become wealthy because they've effectively served consumers. The idea that simply because you've been successful and that you've earned money as a result, that you owe something more, that you should give back, kind of suggests that you must have taken something in the first place that you shouldn't have. But if you look at the typical ethical entrepreneur who doesn't use government favors to disadvantage his competitors, whose wealth is entirely justified by the willing customers who like and purchase his product, then you've got to say they've already done an enormous amount for society. They've provided employment, in many cases, maybe for tens of thousands of people. They've paid taxes, from property taxes to payroll and sales taxes and what have you. This idea that just because they're successful, they owe yet more, that they have some special obligation that others don't have as well, is really just pure demagoguery. It's, I hear it sometimes when people donate to organizations like mine. They say, well, I like what you do and I want to give back. And I'm quick to say, wait a minute, you don't owe me anything. You've already done far more than most people I know to improve the economy, give people opportunities and produce products and save lives and what have you. You've already done more than most people have just by being an entrepreneur. So you don't owe me anything more. Don't feel bad about what you've earned. You don't owe me anything. So I don't like this idea of, I've got to give back because it kind of suggests that there's a cloud hanging over you and you owe me something just because you've been successful.
Right. No, it's a a bad idea built on misconceptions, and of course this giving back is rarely defined either. It's just a slogan and a phrase that gets thrown around. But something else. Yeah,
People
go
should
ahead.
feel like they're being taken to the cleaners. These are demagogues who are trying to make you feel as though you've been shortchanged by somebody and that they're the saviors that you need to vote for. It's a gimmick, it's a scam, and there's no kernel of truth in it.
Yeah. Now, something else that we hear from the Clinton campaign is that there is inherent racism and there is inherent sexism, and the statistics that show that women make less than men, or that people of minority background make less than whites or people of European ancestry, that proves that there's discrimination and there's inherent racism and sexism, and it proves that there are issues with the free markets in regards to how they treat people of different groups. So where are progressives wrong on these issues?
Progressives don't understand that in a genuinely free market, discrimination for unfounded reasons, silly reasons like sex or race, actually is very, very costly. Because the moment you decide, I don't want to pay this person as much as he's worth or he's asking simply because of his color or his sex, then another entrepreneur will be happy to say, well, wait a minute, I can make more money by offering just a bit more than that guy and grab that person away. When you look at the numbers, time and time again, you discover that this claim that women or minorities are paid vastly less for identical work than other people are. You find when you look at those numbers that they're hyped, they're exaggerated. It's a glimpse at a short-term phenomenon. It's not a snapshot of the dynamism that really happens in free market economies. So I think it's another tool of demagogues with not nearly the economic background and facts that you'd need to justify massive government intervention.
Right, and of course these statistics themselves are riddled with errors. Oftentimes they don't account for the hours worked, they don't account for the types of jobs performed, the level of education, whether it be formal or informal. There are just all kinds of issues with those numbers before we even get into evaluating what the free market actually has to say about discrimination and racism and sexism.
That's right.
I want to...
So many exceptions to the rule, too. So many women who are doing very well in the marketplace. So many blacks who have come from disadvantaged backgrounds to become very successful. So those are exceptions that exist widely, but progressives rarely talk about.
Absolutely. So I want to move on to a theme that Hillary Clinton's chief primary opponent, Bernie Sanders, liked to express in the campaign trail, and that is the notion that big business is a major problem and that the only way to rein it in is by having an enormous government and all sorts of regulatory agencies and all sorts of programs that are offer some sort of check on big business. What's the deal with that idea?
Yeah, that's these things are tossed around rather cavalierly, and we're supposed to fear the mere suggestion of bigness in business. But when I look around in the free market and I see big businesses like McDonald's, for instance, yeah, they're big, but they can't force me to do anything. They're entirely dependent upon my voluntary patronage. Now, I know there are businesses who use their political connections, as I've said before, but I'm not talking about those. I'm against that kind of thing, as any free market advocate would be. But in a genuinely free market, businesses of all sizes must serve customers or they go out of business. And all you need is a dynamic, competitive, free economy, and even the most abusive of businesses will see patronage go elsewhere and see new entrepreneurs picking up where they've left off and grabbing their customers if they misbehave.
Right, and another issue that comes up in Democratic Party politics every time an election rolls around is that of labor unions, and you always see the various candidates jockeying to earn the endorsements from the AFL-CIO and from the Communication Workers of America and United Auto Workers and IBEW, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of this is predicated on the notion that labor unions have been essential in the increases in wages and increased standard of living. So what's the truth there? Are labor unions rightly given credit for raising wages and increased standard of living, or should labor unions not be given credit for those things and should credit go elsewhere?
I think the credit overwhelmingly goes elsewhere. Labor unions, armed with the special privileges that government has given them, things like the right of exclusive representation. If 50% plus one of the workers at a work site vote to join, they can, by law, they can impose their contracts on all the other workers in so-called non-right to work states and other privileges. It's true that unions can raise the wages for some people, but that's not the same as saying that they have raised wages across the board. They may be raising wages for some at the expense of others. You take the automobile industry or the mining industry, which in both cases had far more people employed in them years ago. Yeah, those who are still employed are getting reasonably high wages. But what about the wages of the people who don't have jobs there, in part because unions have effectively priced them out of the labor market? That's rarely factored in. So many people just look at the wages of those who keep their jobs. But what if many others never got a start because unions have demanded so much that there just isn't as many people employed in those industries? So I think unions and their benefit to the worker are vastly overstated. The greatest friend of the worker, especially now in our high-tech age, is a free and competitive market. In the private sector today, barely 6% of workers are in unions. That means 94% of private sector workers are not in unions. Well, nobody in his right mind would claim that the 94% are suffering and disadvantaged and living terrible lives of poverty and depredation, and the 6% are doing well. If anything, it's the unionized industries in the country that are chronically in difficulty and are seeing their employment chronically in decline.
Right, and of course we often see labor unions backing legislation for higher minimum wages, Davis-Bacon Act back in the FDR era, all sorts of legislation that effectively prices out less skilled workers who would earn lower wages in the absence of these government regulations, but also in the absence of these government regulations would earn a wage and would have the ability to begin a career path in some industry and work their way up from there.
That's right, and unions are typically in the forefront of calling for higher taxes too, and supporting politicians who promote higher taxes and more government. So if you're a worker who is compelled to join a union, you should be thinking that the cost to you is not just the dues you pay, it's the higher taxes you pay because of all the politicians that your union supports.
Right. So just a few more topics I want to touch on here. And the next one is something that we hear, maybe not in these words, but at least in the way they discuss quote-unquote policy. We hear from Democrats, Republicans, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton. We hear this all the time. And that's the importance of government spending, and that jobs and prosperity come as a result of government spending. Now, sometimes Republicans might hide that rhetoric in discussion of the free market and the private sector, and they're probably better on this issue than Democrats. But we hear this across the political spectrum, throughout politics, that government spending is the key to jobs and prosperity. So, what's the deal there? Is that the case? Is that wrong?
You know, after World War II, when so many people expected, with the decline in government spending, that we would slip back into depression, we saw a fantastic recovery in the economy. And I think it was in great measure because we saw the biggest reduction in government spending in American history, largely through demobilization of the war effort after 1945. Well, that raises questions about the progressive notion that government spending, when it spends more, it stimulates, and when it spends less, it somehow hurts the economy. I think government spending represents a diversion of resources. Instead of you spending and stimulating the industries you choose to patronize. It's politicians with all their other considerations like re-election who are spending it instead. I don't see where the stimulus comes in. They're not magically creating wealth out of thin air. They're simply diverting it from your choices to theirs. So I don't think government itself, by its act of spending, is stimulative, with the only exception being the very kinds of things that would be stimulative if it was done in the private sector, namely investment in, say, necessary infrastructure. But that simply allows for greater productivity in the private sector, which is where the engine of growth and productivity is, not in government or government spending.
Right, and of course when we see government spending in infrastructure, these projects and these jobs are often based on which representatives in Congress have which connections, or which corporations have which connections, and where they located. So where do the favors get handed out? And to the extent that there are workers who get these jobs, then they're only temporary positions, and they have to go figure out something else to do once those brief infrastructure projects are over.
That's right. If you want a sustainable job, you want employment in a successful private firm that keeps its ear to the ground, that pays attention to its customers, that employs new technologies, that's on the cutting edge of innovation. None of that describes government.
Right. So on the subject of sustainable jobs, how about this notion that robots and computerization and improving technology and new developments in technology are causing unemployment and restricting the ability of individuals to get sustainable and high-paying jobs?
Well, when somebody switches from one way of providing a good to another, there's no question there can be short-term dislocations. When American agriculture, which once employed about 98% of Americans a little over 2 centuries ago, as American agriculture began to use more in the way of machinery and technology, some farmers left the business because we didn't need them, and that caused some short-term dislocations. But it would be rather absurd to claim that unemployment today is due to the fact that we've fallen from 98% of our people employed in the farm to about 3%. I mean, the fact is, when you employ machinery, technology, even robotics, and you end up producing more goods at lower cost, you have savings that then can be deployed in the production of other things. So I'm not concerned about robotics and other kinds of improvements that enable us to produce more goods. I think those things simply cause no more than short-term dislocations, and in the long run create more opportunities, produce more goods at lower costs, and create new technologies and new businesses.
All right, now something else that we hear as part of the conventional narrative, and we hear from politicians all the time, is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And if someone takes a very quick glance at statistics and doesn't think much about it, they might reach that conclusion. But what's the truth about that claim?
Yeah, it would be kind of like looking at a horse race, and in the middle of it, and observing that one horse is ahead, and expressing horror at that, and deciding, well, we have to do something about that. The fact is, in the free market, the horse race is never over, and there may be some people ahead at the moment, but the question is, what about the longer term? And the fact is that over the last 50, 60 years, the mobility of Americans from one income level up the ladder to another has been among the best in the world. We have a smaller portion of our people in abject poverty than ever before, and very little of that is due to government action. It's more due by far to the productivity of the private economy. Just think how much more progress we could have enjoyed in reducing poverty if the government had grown along with all these other things and blocked so much economic progress. So I'm not too concerned that some people for the moment may be ahead. I want to know what are the obstacles we're putting in the way of everybody else so that they too can get ahead. And government would have a full-time job if all it did was to dismantle the obstructions it's put in the way of people who want to get ahead.
Right, and of course, when someone looks at the statistics and sees that maybe the bottom quintile or so of wage earners from 1 year is lower than it was from a previous year, they're not factoring in that those aren't necessarily the same people. There's tremendous income mobility still, even in this system with all these government barriers, and a lot of the time the people in that bottom quintile are new to that bottom quintile. They might be immigrants or young people who haven't had a chance to advance very far within the work world, within the economy, whatever it may be. But these are not necessarily the same people as, say, 10 years prior that make up that quintile. Those people, for the most part, have already moved on and are making more.
That's exactly right. And it's strange and ironic that progressives who love to whine about the gap between the rich and the poor routinely support policies that exacerbate that gap. I mean, they're the ones who like the idea of granting special favors and bailouts to the big guys. They're the ones who support increases in the minimum wage law, which prices the least skilled and the poorest of people out of the marketplace. They're the ones who support a Federal Reserve policy that ends up producing booms and busts with the already well-connected and well-off doing better than the poor. If they were really serious about wanting to close the gap between rich and poor, they would get off the back of a free economy and allow it to grow instead of constantly butting up against these stupid and unproductive policies they support.
Sure, and of course there are many, many, many topics in this book, so we're not even scratching the surface here, and I know we're running out of time, but there are two more I want to get to before we conclude. And the first one is the idea of historical preservation. Why is the government not necessary for that? Why can historical preservation occur without government action?
The historic preservation is simply the recognition on the part of people that certain assets have value because of their history. And there are endless examples around the country of historic things that have been preserved by the private sector. And generally speaking, when the private sector does it, it tends to be preserved and not subjected to the whims of future politicians. So when government gets involved, you often have problems like the declaring an area of a city a historic area and using government force to prevent people from changing their homes. I think if something is truly of historic value, the way to prove it is by offering to buy it, or by allowing the marketplace to assess its value, by allowing private people using their own resources to preserve what they regard as worth preserving.
All right, and last one for you. And this might be the most interesting chapter of the book, believe it or not, because there are so many myths and misconceptions and incorrect claims that are dispelled in this one. And this flies 100% in the face of everything that you hear in a high school or college class when this topic is brought up. But the general narrative goes that Upton Sinclair's The Jungle proved that regulation was necessary because of what it exposed in the meatpacking industry. So what's the truth about Upton Sinclair's The Jungle and the background behind that and the claims that go along with that book and then the regulations that ensued from there?
The first thing that your listener should understand is that The Jungle by Upton Sinclair was not some sort of documentary. It was a fictional novel. It wasn't full of documented evidence of one thing or another that he wrote about. In fact, the portion of the book that had the most public impact, that produced the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, is really just a few pages, and it's laced with inaccuracies and charges that were simply cooked up for this fictional novel. There was government meat inspection before the Act of 1906 was passed. As was pointed out in the debate in Congress, what changed after 1906 was that the cost of that meat inspection, instead of being borne by private meat packers who had an incentive to make sure that their meat was saleable to the public and in good condition, Instead of their paying the bill, the taxpayers picked up the tab. Even Teddy Roosevelt made the statement that Upton Sinclair was a liar, that he'd cooked up these charges that weren't the case at all, including the idea that men were falling into the vats of meat and being ground up and then sold to the public as a meat product. But that never happened. You have to ask yourself, if men were falling into these vats, well, what were their names? And I tried to find their names as I did research on this topic. There are no names. There are no monuments to them. You can bet that if there were such people, if that did happen, that progressives would be erecting monuments to them. But it never happened. It's all cooked up, which raises questions about the whole veracity of Upton Sinclair's book as a source of anything but fiction.
Right, and no one in these high school and college classes stops to ask about these people who were supposedly ground up and for those names. But it's a very interesting point that we never hear these names. Why don't we hear these names?
Yeah, and why didn't their families sue?
Right.
Why didn't somebody say, "Where's Bob today?"
Right. No, it's very odd, but of course the truth is that as you pointed out, this narrative was almost entirely made up, and of course Upton Sinclair's political ideology and the grant money that he received from various organizations fit right in with the narrative that he was putting forth in the jungle, even if the facts and reality did not.
He was in the best of the progressive tradition, which is to invent a crisis if there isn't one already, and suggest the government was an innocent bystander in its creation and is our savior in somehow fixing it.
Yep, but yet the conclusions that were reached was that we needed an FDA because of this, so there you go.
Friends.
Yeah, so, all right, so we've done all this complaining about progressive myths. We've touched on some solutions here and there, but in about a minute, can you sum up what the solutions would be to progressivism?
I think knowledge is the solution to progressive myths. As the book points out, so much of progressivism is just a bunch of bumper stickers. It's charges without justification or without facts or with twisted facts or half-truths. I think the answer to progressivism is to know what actually happened in our past and to understand the nature of human beings, the nature of free people, the nature of government itself. When you have that kind of information at your fingertips, I think you're far better equipped to respond to these misconceptions, and you have much more confidence in what free people can accomplish, not what politicians can do with political force on their behalf.
All right, so if someone wants to learn more about what we've been discussing today, obviously the book is a great place to go, and I'll mention the full title of that again in a moment. But if someone wants to take a look at other resources or other readings, or they like what they've heard from you and they want to follow more of your work, where would you direct them?
I would direct them to our website, that of the Foundation for Economic Education. That website is fee.org, and there you'll find nearly 70 years of archived, easily searchable information and a daily source of insightful commentary on a wide range of issues. It's a treasure trove of economics and of free market ideas that we're very proud of at FEE.
Okay, very good. So the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/progressivism-myths. And of course, we'll link to the book we've been discussing. And again, the full title of that is Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myths of Progressivism. So there'll be links from the show notes page if you want to buy it or take a look at it, look at some reviews on the book. You can do that from there. And of course, there will also be links to fee.org and to the appropriate Facebook and Twitter pages and all the resources and readings that we've mentioned over the course of this interview. So again, the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/progressivism-myths. And I want to encourage everybody while they're on our website to sign up for our email list and to subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher or another podcatcher of your choice. And that way you can make sure to get all the episodes and not miss any. And Larry, thank you so much for joining me today for this what we might describe as a whirlwind tour through progressive myths. But this was a lot of fun, and we got to a lot of myths, and the book is just so extensive. There's so many topics in there that, as I said earlier, we're not even scratching the surface here. But I feel like this will be a good place to start, for people to start, and this will be a good way to whet someone's appetite if they want to learn more and if they want to take a look at your book. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate it very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.